Hi everyone. I've just got a short lecture here, just sort of summarizing the key points from chapters 11 and 12 of DiNitto and Johnson. I'll spend a few minutes talking about diversity and sort of the challenges that diversity presents to policy. So in chapter 11, DiNitto and Johnson sort of talk extensively about the feminization of poverty, and this is something we've seen sort of throughout the history of social welfare, and something we've sort of danced around throughout this class. For instance, we questioned sort of women who were seeking support, unwed women with children who were seeking support in either Elizabethan England or the colonial U.S. Remember that it was not uncommon for municipalities to chase down fathers or people who were suspected of fathers to support their children. And so what all of this sort of gets us to is this idea of the feminization of poverty. And why is it that we've had to feminize poverty? And that's frankly because women are always at a higher risk of poverty than men are. Part of the reason women are at risk for poverty is that they tend to be caretakers, or caregivers. They tend to be the people who are caring for others, either children or the elderly, or frankly people who are sick. And they've been excluded from the workforce. Even when they have been included in the workforce, there's been a wage gap which we've attempted to eliminate through legislation, and that relates pretty closely to this idea of comparable worth, which is sort of equal pay for equal work. Some of the big policies we'll talk about on the next slide. But as I said before, this idea that the task of caring for family members, right, whether they're very young or very old or just people who are very sick, has been one of the sort of vulnerabilities that have left women vulnerable to poverty. And then, of course, there remains sort of significant contention around the issue of healthcare and abortion, access to contraception, that kind of thing. So some of the key policies and court decisions, just to be aware of, Roe v. Wade, or Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade was a Supreme Court case in the 70s that upheld the rights of women to receive or to get an abortion. The access to abortion has been eroded in various ways since the 70s by different states, and it sort of continues to be sort of this big point of contention. The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, has criminalized gender-based violence, and then things like the Equal Pay and Equal Credit Act have been really to ensure that women have the same access to credit and compensation that men do. And then, of course, the Family Medical Leave Act was one of the things that was intended to protect women who needed to take time away from work in order to care for someone in their family. Certainly men have rights under FMLA, but part of that idea was to allow women to be caretakers for a period of time and then return to the workforce without a significant blow to their career. Sexual harassment was prohibited in the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, and then in the 70s, Title IX of the educational amendments to the Civil Rights Act is what sort of ensured access to certain forms of contraception and women's health issues. Title IX is what funds a lot of Planned Parenthood's reproductive health services, that kind of thing. At the same time, there is progress on rights work for LGBTQ individuals. A couple of cases to know, a couple of policies to know are on this slide here. Let me talk through them real quick. Oklahoma City Board of Education versus National Gay Task Force actually outlawed discrimination based on sexual orientation. And that was a significant win for the LGBTQ community. However, some years later, Bowers versus Hardwick, these both were Supreme Court cases, was sort of a setback. And that was in Bowers v. Hardwick, the Supreme Court refused to strike down the sodomy law in the state of Georgia. So that in effect allowed states to continue to criminalize same-sex sexual contact. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the 90s policy that allowed LGBTQ individuals to serve in the military, and that of course has been under threat recently, despite the fact that it was about 20 years old. And there's some important ongoing efforts to ensure that things like gender expression and sexual orientation are included in the Civil Rights Act or some kind of comparable legislation. Now, the thing I want to point out is when we're talking about women, we're talking about the rights of the LGBTQ community. There is no talk of sort of enshrining equality in through a constitutional amendment, and that frankly is problematic. Doing so would be tough and require an awful lot of sort of organizing and advocacy and work, but it's significant that we're not talking about that level of political action or policy action at this time. One of the significant contemporary challenges confronting the LGBT community is discrimination among young people, and we often see discrimination and bullying resulting in suicide, the suicide of young LGBTQ people, and that's a significant problem as well. A couple of key court cases related to race, ethnicity, and immigration. A couple of things to know. Obviously, discrimination based on race was outlawed in the Civil Rights Act, but the U.S. obviously has a very long and contentious history of conflict based around race. A couple of court cases related to school funding and school desegregation. Plessy versus Ferguson, which was actually passed pre-1900, it was the separate but equal, or sort of the court case that established the separate but equal doctrine. And then Brown versus Board of Education is essentially the one that struck that down. In Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court said that separate is inherently unequal, and it was really that case that led to the integration of schools, which of course started with busing, which was like I said, an attempt to integrate. Housing and racial discrimination remains kind of a big deal, or a big problem for our country. Redlining was the practice of mortgage companies. It's sort of called redlining because apparently the mortgage companies took red pens or red markers and drew lines around the areas where they refused to fund or approve mortgages. So it essentially restricted access to a mortgage if a person wanted to live in certain areas. This is what created what's known as white flight and the growth of suburbs and sort of the departure of white families from cities into the suburbs. And that sort of coincided with Eisenhower's construction of the big national trans-state highway system in the 50s and 60s. This was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act. but it remains a pretty substantial issue since in much of the United States, urban or city is sort of code for poor, and suburban or rural is sometimes code for wealthy, particularly suburban. Let me just move my picture real quick so we can see this last one. So affirmative action was another idea from the 90s, and affirmative action was was this idea that employment or admission to women for admission to college or university, for example, for women and members of racial and ethnic groups should be proportionate to their representation in the population. That's not to say that there should be equal numbers of groups admitted or employed based on employment. That's to say that the number should be equal based on their representation in the population. So if, just for example, members of a certain racial and ethnic minority group were, let's say, 25% of the population, and maybe the majority members of a racial or ethnic population were, let's say, at 50%, then that means if a company, for example, was following an affirmative action protocol, that the percentage of their employees would correspond roughly to those proportions. So it would be 50% from the minority or from the majority group, and then 25% from the minority group. Affirmative action sort of is in contrast to this idea of non-discrimination, and that's what's led to sort of affirmative action being such a sort of contentious political issue, and that's affirmative action does allow for a certain amount of discrimination, typically privileging members of the minority group, and that's sort of in conflict with this idea of non-discrimination and this idea that a company or a university should be able to hire or admit the person who is best suited for the job. So affirmative action is one of these places where we actually see people from different political spectrums aligned around issues of non-discrimination. Voter discrimination has sort of helped the Republican Party stay in power or consolidate its power in many parts of the U.S. So gerrymandering refers to drawing districts so that it's typically in favor of one political party. That's why you get districts that have just bizarre shapes to them, and that's because they're drawn to include or exclude members of certain parties. Now, there's always going to be a diversity of political opinions, and so the whole way that districts are drawn is in such a way to limit the number of people who would tend to vote one way or the other. It's not that you're eliminating that group completely. It's just that you're limiting the number of districts and thus the number of representatives that person has in whatever, or that group of people have in whatever legislative body we're talking about here. Voter ID laws is actually a very simple concept. Voter ID laws is this idea that you need some form of identification, government-issued identification, in order to be able to vote. That form of identification might be a social security card or a driver's license or a military ID or something like that. And of course, the big issue with voter ID laws is that people who are deeply poor often don't have any form of ID, and it could be because they can't afford to pay the fees associated with getting that ID. It might be because they don't have access to a birth certificate or something like that. Certainly someone who immigrated to the U.S. might not have access to a birth certificate, and so obtaining a driver's license or some other form of identification might be tough. Proponents of voter ID laws tend to say that it prevents voter fraud. The research tends to show that there's very little voter fraud, and certainly not enough to make a difference. Last form of voter discrimination that we'll talk about real quick is disenfranchising people who are convicted of felonies. So for a long time in the U.S., if you were convicted of a felony, you're not able to vote. You lose that right. And that's what disenfranchise means, right? So enfranchising is giving someone the right to vote. Disenfranchising is denying them the right to vote. There are some movements to enfranchise people who have been convicted of felonies once they've sort of repaid their debt. That's often, some time in prison and then some time on parole after that. Florida recently passed an enfranchisement law for felons. Part of the rationale for the disenfranchisement law is that it's supposed to dissuade people from committing felonies. To the extent that it does is something that I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at that. But it also sort of has a values proposition as well, and that's that if you're going to commit a crime, you shouldn't have a right to say, something in how a country or municipality is run. On the other hand, the value statement for re-enfranchising people after they've served their debt to society is that, is saying something along the lines of, you're able to get a second chance in a country that has long been, has a long history of providing people with second chances, or, we're sort of giving you the chance to reestablish or restart your life. So there's really some conflicting values there as well. The treatment of American Indians has been rather contentious in the U.S. There have been a number of different government attempts to sort of manage Indian affairs that started with the House and Senate committees on Indian affairs around the turn of the 20th century, then moved to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service, culminated sort of with the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. The Cobell versus Salazar case was an attempt to return American Indian resources to their control. So it was an attempt to return lands, mineral rights, water rights, air rights, that kind of thing, all to the control of the Indian nations, so that they could have some say in how they in how they're used or protected, or both. For many American Indian tribes, poverty, substance abuse, lack of education, and violence are all significant things. And then, of course, immigration is a fairly complex and divisive issue. We often hear immigration talked about in terms of illegal or legal immigration. Better terms might be authorized or unauthorized immigration. Those were terms that were sort of codified in the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act passed under Reagan. So in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act did a couple of things. It provided amnesty for people who were already here. It provided funding for border security. It sanctioned employers who hired unauthorized immigrants in an attempt to dissuade them from doing so in the future. And then it also created a temporary worker program, and that temporary worker program was of significant benefit to people who rely on temporary forms of immigrant labor, agriculture, ranching, that kind of thing. So people who bring in folks to work for a couple of weeks or a couple of months on a specific set of tasks, maybe a harvest or a planting or something like that. And that's really all in service of getting crops into and out of the field and onto our plates. So given the complexity of immigration, what I wanted to put on the slide here was just a couple of different ways to think about immigration. There has been so this is sort of an overly simplistic way of thinking about it, but at least it's one way to sort of organize some thoughts about it. So there's always been some form of humanitarian immigration. We've allowed people to enter the country because they're escaping a situation that is terrible somewhere else, perhaps in their own country. So we've allowed them to immigrate, maybe to the U.S., maybe because they're persecuted, their religious liberties, their religious freedoms are trampled on. Maybe there's a health reason. That kind of thing. So that's typically a humanitarian justification for immigration. There's also a way to think about immigration in financial terms. So typically immigrants who come with high levels of skill, specialized degrees, specialized in training, oftentimes they make considerable economic contributions. And that's supported by some of the studies available in the literature. On the other hand, there's a perception that immigrants who are low skill, who are perhaps ill, or who are perhaps very old may consume resources and actually end up costing the country money. If you remember from the lecture from a couple of weeks ago, when Bill Clinton reformed welfare back in the 90s with the Personal Responsibility and Work Reconciliation Act. Sorry about that. Error message from my computer there. When Clinton reformed welfare, one of the things he did was disallow people with an immigration status from receiving welfare. So that means that when when immigrants come over who have low skill or who are aged or who are ill, they're often relying on families for support. They're often relying on each other for support if they don't assimilate on their own. Suffice to say, the immigration debate may be overblown. Most of the economic studies show that the positive or negative impact in economic terms of immigration is about 1%. And when something is about 1% of the economy, that's considered small or minor. And so that's typically what immigration, is shown to be is about 1%. So that really, what that suggests is that this is more an issue that's used by politicians to sow a political divisiveness among Americans. Just by way of conclusion here, I thought I'd just give a few thoughts about the interaction of social work policy and diversity. We've obviously made significant progress, but significant work remains. And we see that certainly in racial, sexual, gender inequality, the inequality associated with sexual orientation. But as social workers, we're often advocates for vulnerable groups, and so we often have in mind the needs of groups with different vulnerabilities, and we can advance the principles of justice by keeping in mind the needs of certain groups when we do our advocacy work. So as I see it, I just made a list of sort of threats and opportunities, and this isn't really based on the reading. This is just sort of based on things that I think about. So I thought I'd put it up there just to give you some food for thought. So I see gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and disenfranchisement as a significant threat. I certainly see police brutality and racial profiling and hate crimes as a significant threat. Executive orders related to immigration. Obviously, that's a significant threat, and the use of executive power, the presidential use of executive power to restrict immigration. Essentially what's happening there is the powers being consolidated in the executive branch, and the balance of powers that exist as expressed by the Constitution are sort of being limited. And then, of course, things like economic inequality, the rural and urban divide, That's a significant threat as well, and that sort of aligns with some mistrust of government, a perception of corruption, or a perception that the government exists to serve the needs of the political and economic elite. That's sort of in conflict to what we've talked about in this class, where the role of government is to ensure some level of equality of opportunity, some level of provide some level of a social safety net, and provide the framework for all people to sort of succeed. At any rate, I will conclude there. As always, you're welcome to get in touch with any questions you have. Thanks.